Good morning. Today we will look at a few theories of grammar. So we'll start with traditional grammar. What do you understand by the concept traditional grammar? Traditional grammar would basically mean the Aristotelian orientation towards the nature of language, which we can see in the work of the ancient Greeks and Romans. It is also the speculative approach of the 18th century grammarians, right? So, traditional grammar has a long tradition with it, as the name suggests. And the ideas of traditional grammar about sentence structure is derived from Aristotle and Plato. The ideas about the part of speech from Stoic grammarians and the ideas about the correctness in language from 18th century grammarians of English. Now, what did these grammarians do? They took Latin grammar as the base or as the norm, and they started to analyze English in terms of Latin. So the early grammarians who formulated the grammar of English based it on Latin grammar. So traditional grammar would be defined as the most widespread and influential and the most understood method of discussing languages in the world. It is fairly understood and it is kind of consistently applied by teachers across the globe. So when we look at traditional grammar, we understand that it gives us a very thorough and consistent analysis of declarative sentences. And we can call it the means by which ordinary students and scholars have mastered many languages for centuries. So traditional grammar is a very, it's a very old form of grammar and it is very widespread. But we need to understand that it has got a lot of inadequacies. It has got a lot of shortcomings. And because we need to understand that if traditional grammar was adequate, if it was perfect, we wouldn't have the need to have so many models of modern grammar. So traditional grammar is based mainly on Indo-European classical language, and therefore we can say it's a very poor model for the grammar of languages that differ from Greek, from Latin, from Sanskrit, etc. Traditional grammar does not adequately distinguish between all the linguistic levels, right? There is no distinction between phonetic, morphological, syntactical, and even semantic levels, right? It is prescriptive, right? It's very normative and it is not at all explicit and it's not descriptive. The rules that traditional grammar brings in are quite illogical and they're quite inconsistent and inadequate as a description of actual language in use. So we realize that traditional grammar neglects not only the contemporary usage but also the functional and social varieties of language, because the approach is historical, it is diachronic, right, rather than contemporary or synchronic. And what traditional grammar tries to do is it tries to study a living language like a dead one. So we understand that traditional grammar gives priority to the written form of language. It ignores the notion that the spoken form came much before the written form came. Right? It does not treat all aspects of language adequately. It does not even cover the whole range of languages written form, but it is restricted to the specific kinds of writing, the kind of formal styles in particular. So traditional grammar is inadequate to analyze all the ambiguities, right? Because the methods and the notions are quite inaccurate. They're not accurate, they're not complete, they're not consistent, they cannot be verified. So we realize that the descriptions of traditional grammar are quite intuitive. It's not based on reason, it's quite intuitive and it's quite inexplicit. So when we summarize this, we understand that traditional grammar is something that dates back to classical Greek and Latin languages. It is highly prescriptive, but modern languages descriptive. It gives more importance to writing than the spoken form, right? And it is quite static because it did not develop according to the use and evolution of time. Now, this is how we summarize it. But when we study traditional grammar in depth, we understand that there are a lot of problems with traditional grammar. The first problem is traditional grammar was not, as I said, not concerned with the speech sounds. It is only concerned with writing, and that too, even the very formal kind of writing, right? Secondly, it was based on a Latin model, and it is prescriptive. So, traditional grammar does not have an adequate notion of linguistic rule. It only appeals to your intuition. So there are, rules, but the rules are not adequate. There are no wholesome rules. The learner has to use his common sense or judgments in matters of unstated rules. So this grammar concentrates on giving rules and defining terms, but its rules and definitions are not at all satisfactory, nor are they scientifically sound. So we can conclude that traditional grammar is quite informal, it is not scientific, it is very illogical, there are so many contradictions, it's not adequate, and it is prescriptive. Right? It lacks scientific accuracy. There is no objectivity, there is no precision, because it ignores the contemporary usage and all varieties of language. So, this is what traditional grammar is. But then from there we pass on to something called structural linguistics or modern linguistics, right? Modern linguistics and structural linguistics, same thing. They study language based on a synchronic aspect, whereas traditional grammar studies language based on a diachronic aspect. Structural linguistics would treat language as a system and distinguish between lang and parole. It does not divide language into different fields, and it is not concerned with dialects and native users and regional variation. So this structural linguistics or modern linguistics evolved in the 20th century, and the main person who contributed to structural linguistics was Saussure, Ferdinand de Saussure. So let's look at structural linguistics or modern linguistics, right? So we realize that modern linguistics or structural linguistics has replaced traditional grammar. And structural linguistics gives priority to the spoken word, right? To the spoken language, so the spoken word. When we look at traditional grammarians from the beginning of our own century, we understand that they assumed that the written form was more superior to the spoken form, whereas the structural linguistics maintain that the spoken form came before the written form and must form the main form of linguistic study. So they maintain that the spoken language is primary and that writing is essentially a means of representing speech in another medium. So structural linguistics would give importance to synchronic description, right? Not diachronic. Whereas the traditional and historical grammarians were interested only in the diachronic study. Structuralists, or the people who advocated structural linguistics, found it important to describe language of the day as it is available for study and description, right? So they looked at the present form or the synchronic form or the contemporary form. So synchronic description, what do you mean by synchronic description, or what does synchronic description mean? Synchronic description would mean the study of usage of the day-to-day and of varieties that existed in the language at that particular point of study. Right? It is a contemporary study. So when we kind of make a comparison between traditional grammar and modern linguistics, we understand that traditional grammar is a collection of prescriptive rules and concepts about the structure of language, whereas modern linguistics or structural linguistics is a scientific study of language. It is not just the study of language structure, it includes the study of grammar, syntax, as well as phonetics. So you have phonetics, syntax, semantics, everything, right? So traditional grammar talks only about the structure of language. Traditional grammar origin can be traced back to the 18th century, and modern linguistics or structural linguistics derive from traditional grammar. Traditional grammar is prescriptive, whereas modern linguistics is descriptive. Traditional language focuses on written form, right? The written form, and that too, they just look at the traditional form, right? The modern linguistics or structural linguistics would focus on the spoken form or the speech sounds. And traditional grammarians or traditional grammar would force language into a framework, a Latin-based framework, Whereas modern linguistics does not force language into the framework of another language, right? So that is the difference between traditional grammar and modern linguistics or structural linguistics, right? Okay, now we pass on to another model of grammar, which is called the PS grammar or the phrase structure grammar. So I want you to open your textbooks to page number 114, where you have certain diagrams. I need you to look into into those diagrams, because when I explain them, you should understand, right? Okay, so what is PS grammar or phrase structure grammar? A model of grammar called phrase structure grammar or PS grammar evolved from the concept of immediate constituent analysis or IC analysis, which was developed by the linguist called Leonard Bloomfield, right? What is IC analysis? IC analysis means dividing a sentence into its immediate constituents, IC, right? So when you take a sentence, you can divide it into immediate constituents. For example, if you have a sentence like the cat ran out, right? The cat ran out. You can divide that sentence into immediate constituent analysis. Look at page 114. You can see the example given there. Here the example given is poor John ran out. See how the sentence is broken down. It is broken down into poor John and ran out, right? Subject and predicate. And poor John is again broken into poor plus John. Ran out is again broken down into ran plus out. So they are the IC, the immediate constituents of that sentence, poor John ran out. Now, phrase structure grammar or PS grammar was was described by Noam Chomsky in his book titled Syntactic Structures, right? Now, phrase structure grammar has a set of rules, and these set of rules are called rewrite rules. Now, what are rewrite rules? Rewrite rules are those rules which are capable of generating strings of linguistic elements, right? You can have small elements, right? Linguistic elements, and it can also provide a constituent analysis of the string, right? So a rewrite rule would be a replacement, a kind of replacement rule in which you look at the textbook, you can see a symbol like S, NP, VP. So, you see this symbol S, right? It's on the left. And S can be replaced by the expanded form, NP and VP. So they are the linguistic elements. You can rewrite a sentence. So, you can actually use rewrite rules, or it's also called the replacement rule, by which you can analyze, or which you can kind of show forth, depict a sentence using symbols, right? So when you have a sentence, S, it stands for S, and you can divide that into noun phrase and verb phrase, right? Now, when you have the noun phrase, a noun phrase consists of a noun phrase and a determiner sometimes, right? And the verb phrase would consist of an auxiliary and plus a verb plus a noun phrase plus a past participle and so on. So this is how you can rewrite the sentence, or you can use these rewrite rules. So rewrite rules thus represent how morphemes are organized into words into phrases, and phrases into sentences. So phrase structure grammars have an advantage over IC analysis or immediate constituent analysis model, in that the labels are inbuilt in the rewrite rules, and the rules themselves can be arranged in a sequence so that each rule can be used to rewrite the output of the previous one, right? So suppose you look at this example given here, sentence is equal to noun phrase NP plus verb phrase. NP is equal to, or NP can be rewritten as into immediate constituents as determiner plus noun, determiner plus N. Verb phrase can be rewritten as verb plus noun phrase, right? So you have three kinds of rewrite rules. Now, when you apply these two, like suppose you apply the second one to one. So what happens? You can say sentence again an arrow, it can be depicted as, instead of noun phrase, what can you write? You can write determiner plus noun plus verb phrase. When you apply the third one into the above sentence, what happens? You write sentence can be determined as, or can be broken down as, determiner plus noun plus verb plus noun phrase. That is, instead of writing noun place from plus verb phrase, what do you write? Determiner plus noun plus verb plus noun phrase. So this is the final string, and beyond which the symbols do not take us. So this is the kind of terminal string, right? Or the stage at which the morphophonemic rules are applied to replace symbols by morphemes or words. So the representation of the structure of a sentence is called the phrase marker or the P marker. So the usual form of a P marker is a tree with labeled nodes. Now look at this tree that is given here. It is, my brother gave my son a book. My brother gave my son a book, the P marker. Now, how do you mark the P marker? You have to apply the PS rules or the phrase structure rules to it, right? So, the representation of a structure of the sentence is called the phrase marker or the P marker. Now, the P marker of the sentence is given here. You see, it's a kind of tree diagram. Right? It's a tree diagram. Now, what are the rules, or how can you break that, or how can you use the rewrite rules here? Look at this. My brother gave my son a book. So, my brother is, see the sentence, it can be broken into a noun phrase, right? My brother, it's a noun phrase, right? Gave my son a book is a verb phrase. Now, that noun phrase, my brother, can be again broken down into my plus brother. And the verb phrase, gave my son a book, can be again broken down into a verb plus a noun phrase plus another noun phrase. So what is the verb there? Gave. What is the first noun phrase? My son. What is the second noun phrase? A book. See, again the noun phrase 1 and noun phrase 2 can be again broken into units. So you have my son. So that can be broken down as determiner plus noun. A book, again determiner plus book plus a noun, right? So how can you rewrite? So when you look at the PS rules that generate its constituent structure, we can write something like this: sentence S is equal to, I show an arrow, noun phrase plus verb phrase. The noun phrase can be written as noun plus, so determiner plus noun, right? The verb phrase can be written as verb plus noun phrase plus noun phrase. Right? This is how you use PS rules to create the constituent structure. Now, every node in the tree where there is a branch, right? See, noun phrase got another branch. So that is called a branching node. And the one without any branch is called a non-branching node. Look at the verb phrase. The verb phrase is a branching node. When again it is branched out into verb plus noun phrase plus noun phrase. That noun phrase, both these noun phrases, noun phrase 1 and noun phrase 2, are again branching nodes. Whereas the verb is a non-branching node because there is no other branch from that, right? It just is a verb, right? So we have branching nodes and also non-branching nodes, right? See how non-branching nodes and branching nodes are represented on page 116, right? A node that can be further expanded or rewritten is called a non-terminal node, right? And one that cannot be is a terminal node. So you look at noun phrase there, it is a non-terminal node because it can be further expanded into determiner plus noun. But verb phrase is a terminal node because it cannot be determined further into different branches. It is just a terminal node. It cannot be further branched, right? So this is PS grammar or phrase structure grammar. Now, phrase structure grammar has got a lot of limitations. That is why we cannot use phrase structure grammar always. Now, there are a few limitations. The first limitation is phrase structure grammar cannot show inter-sentence relationships. That means PS grammar cannot show the relationship between simple, complex, and compound sentences. It does not show the relationship between active-passive forms, affirmative-negative forms, and so on, right? Second thing is, the discontinuous constituents cannot be accommodated by phrase structure rules, right? So when you say, will you sing a song, you cannot accommodate using that particular sentence using, taking into consideration the PS rules. Thirdly, PS grammar cannot account for certain kind of ambiguities. Like we talked about lexical ambiguities and syntactic ambiguities, right? So these two ambiguities, lexical ambiguity and the syntactic ambiguity, cannot be explained by PS grammar, right? So what is lexical ambiguity? Lexical ambiguity is ambiguity that is caused when the same word has more than one meaning. For example, rest, right? Nail, right? Bank. These are all words with lexical ambiguity. It has got more than one meaning. Structural ambiguity or syntactic ambiguity is caused when a particular sentence structure has more than one meaning. When we say flying planes can be dangerous, it is an example of syntactic ambiguity. Now, this cannot be accounted with the help of PS rules or phrase structure rules. Then the close relationship between the verb and the particle in phrases like phrasal verbs, you have phrasal verbs like take off, make up, etc., cannot be shown by PS rules. Next, you have the property of recursion. Property of recursion is the process by which we can go on joining sentences. It cannot be accounted for by phrase structure rules. And one more limitation that we have is stylistic variations cannot be accounted for by PS grammar rules. For example, when we say Sam seldom visits me, you want to make a stylistic variation to that. Seldom does Sam visit me. You cannot account that using phrase structure grammar. So phrase structure grammar has got a lot of limitations, and that is why we had to find another model which we call transformational generative grammar. Right? So transformational generative grammar is again Noam Chomsky's theories, and it was he actually published that in his 1957 book titled Syntactic Structures, but he brought about a new version in 1965 in his book Aspects of the Theory of Syntax. Now this term transformational generative, it makes us understand that there are two aspects to this theory. There is the transformational aspect as well as the generative aspects. These two aspects are independent aspects that interact. Now, what is the transformational relation between structures? Now, grammatical theories, as far as IC analysis and PS grammar, when IC analysis or PS grammar is used to analyze individual sentences to show the function of their various parts and their relationships, we understand that they do not show inter-sentence relationships. We were talking about the limitations of phrase structure grammar. There is no relation, it doesn't have any relation. I mean, the relationship between simple, complex, compound sentences, active, passive, etc., cannot be shown using IC analysis, right? So we understand that these theories like IC analysis or PS grammar, they analyze these sentences to show functions of their various parts, but they would not show inter-sentence relationships, whereas TG grammar or transformational generative grammar shows the essential relationship between such sentences such as active, passive, affirmative, negative, etc. Right? So it shows how different types of sentences are derived from basic type of simple sentences, and how is that shown? It is shown through the application of certain rules called the transformational rules or T rules. Now, such basic types of sentences are called the kernel sentences, right? So we have basic sentences, the kernel sentences, from which we can derive different types of sentences using T rules or transformational rules, right? So the kernel sentences would be simple sentences, affirmative sentences, active sentences, declarative sentences, and so on. Now, when you apply T rules to these kernel sentences, we get new sentences. Like, when you have an active passive sentence, right? When you have an active sentence, what is it? It will be like sentence one. Sentence one would be divided using the immediate constituent analysis. We would say noun phrase one plus auxiliary plus verb plus noun phrase two, right? For example, when you say, I have written a book, right? I have written a book. I is noun phrase one, have is the auxiliary, written is the verb, a book is noun phrase two. Now, applying T rules, the corresponding string of S2 can be formed. That is the passive voice. That would be, I have written a book. So, noun phrase 1 plus auxiliary plus verb plus noun phrase 2. Now, when you apply T rules, what happens is you get the form noun phrase 2, a book, was auxiliary, written, past participle or the verb, by me, right? By me. So, me becomes the noun phrase 1. So, you have noun phrase 2 plus auxiliary plus the past participle form of the verb plus by plus the noun phrase 1. So, S1 is the kernel sentence. It's the active sentence. By applying T rules to S1, we get S2, the transformed or the passive sentence. For example, if we have the sentence S1, John killed the snake. So when you have S2, it will be the snake was killed by John. Snake was killed by John. So this is how we form the corresponding passive or the transform sentence by applying the T rule. So all different types of sentences that we see in English are transforms of the simple basic structure of the kernel sentence. So transformations would include the rearrangement of elements, like when you say he can sing, you can also rearrange and say can he sing. Addition of elements, right? When you say it will rain and you want to make it a negative sentence, you say it will not rain, you add something. Deletion of elements, right? Like you do it, you can also say do it. Substitution of elements, right? So when I say I did it and you say I did it myself, right? So in the 1957 model that Chomsky had proposed, TG grammar is organized into three components. You have the basic component, the transformational component, and the morphophonemic component. So what is the base component? Or it's a base component is also called the phrase structure component, right? You have this sentence which is divided into the noun phrase plus the verb phrase. For example, look at this sentence. Look at this sentence in your text on page 118. Jim brought the blanket, right? Jim brought the blanket. Now, when you say Jim brought the blanket, you have noun phrase plus verb phrase. Noun phrase can be, it's just formed of a noun. So when you have something like that, we say it's a non-branching node or it is a terminal node, right? So you have the noun. And the verb phrase can be divided into brought the blanket. So verb plus noun phrase, right? So you have verb plus noun phrase, and the noun phrase again can be further divided into determiner plus noun, the blanket, right? So that is the base component or the phrase structure component. The next one is transformational component. This part would contain the rules known as T rules. And these T rules can transform the sentence into various forms. It can, transform as active sentence to passive, negative to affirmative, and so on. And the third one is the morphophonemic component. Now, morphophonemic component is the part which converts the output of the transformation component into a phonemic transcription, right? So you can transform the output of, you can convert the output of a transformational component into a phonemic transcription. So you can transcribe that into a phonetic or a phonemic transcription. Now we talked about transformational generative, right? So what is generative? TG grammar is also generative since it must be able to generate all the grammatical sentences in a language. To generate means to predict, to specify what could be possible sentences in a language. So, any language data has a finite number of sentences, right? It has got, data has got a corpus, so the language data has got a finite number of sentences, but a language would consist of infinite number of sentences. So TG grammar has finite number of rules, which would enable us to generate an infinite set of sentences in the language. So the actual sentences of the language and also the possible ones can be generated using the T rules, right? Or the set of transformational rules that we have in TG grammar. So there are a finite number of rules. Using these T rules, we can generate infinite number of sentences. So that is the generative component of transformational generative grammar. From that, we pass on to something called deep structure and sentence and surface structure. Now, this is also proposed by Noam Chomsky, and he speaks about the deep structure and surface structure in transformational generative grammar. So in this TG grammar, deep structure is also called as deep grammar or D structure. It is the underlying syntactic structure or the level of a sentence or the abstract representation of a sentence. So that is deep structure. Surface structure, on the other hand, is the outward form of a sentence. Surface structure would correspond to the version of the sentence that can be spoken or heard, right? So a modified version of the concept of the surface structure is called S structure. So you have D structure, which is deep grammar, and you have S structure, which is the surface structure. Right? So major grammatical relationships like subject of, object of are defined as at the deep structure level. All lexical insertions would occur as deep structures. All transformations would occur after deep structure. Semantic interpretations would occur at deep structures, right? So when you have sentences like this, look at these three sentences. You close the door is closed by you, close the door. You close the door is closed by you, and close the door. Now in the first sentence, we see it's an active sentence. You close the door, right? Second one is the door was closed by you is a passive sentence. And the last one is close the door. It is a command, so it's an imperative sentence. But when we take a look closely, we find that in these three sentences, there is a very close relationship. There's even identical, you can call them, identical in meaning, right? This is because they have the same underlying abstract representation called deep structure. It is defined as the abstract level of structural organization in which all the elements determining structural interpretation are represented. So, deep structure of these sentences, which are the same, are transformed through T rules to different surface structures. So, the surface structures would be active, passive, imperative, right? The deep structure would be the abstract level of structural organization in which all the elements determining structural interpretation are represented, right? So these are the deep structures, right? In these three sentences, you can see these three sentences you can say they are very closely related. So the representation is a deep structure representation. But the surface structure would be transforming these sentences using T rules. Look at these sentences. John is eager to please and John is easy to please. In the first sentence, John is the subject of the word please, right? John wants to please people. He is eager about that. In the second sentence, John acts as the object of please, right? In the first sentence, John is the subject of please. In the second sentence, John is the object of please. That means people want to please John. That means they find it easy to please John. Now, John, in the first sentence, John is eager for himself to please people. In the second sentence, John is easy for people to please him. So these two sentences have the same surface structure, right? They have the same surface structure, hence they will have the same tree diagram. But the meaning or the deep structure of these two sentences are very different, right? So the deep structure is different. The surface structure is the same. So the differences between the deep structure and surface structure isn't or it wasn't shown in IC analysis or in PS grammar. But transformational generative grammar shows how deep structures are transformed to surface structures using T rules. So this is all about the basic theories of grammar. Do you have any questions regarding this? I think you can just listen to this lecture again. You can also go through your textbooks. And if you have any questions, you can come back and we can just clear your doubts. If no questions now, we can close for now. Thank you very much.